This is all about holding on to maximum power until he actually gets into number 10. Welcome to The State of It, the political podcast from The Times and The Sunday Times. I'm Stephen Swinford, the political editor of The Times.
And I'm Lara Spirit, the deputy political editor of The Sunday Times.
Let's start off with Andy Burnham and why he's very angry with all the speculation about cabinet. So, look, listeners, we will take you into the future. We're going to have the World Cup final on Sunday, July the 19th. And the following day, Andy Burnham will walk into number 10. There's the transition of power. And the approach he wants to take is a one and done approach where he will effectively announce all of them, including his Chancellor, on the same day. And his people say there is precedent for this. And actually, it's really annoying, all of the demand for kind of information about who is in his cabinet. Other people have not had to do this. That's right. There is a sense of frustration there, Lara.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a sense of, can everybody just calm down a little bit?
Yes.
Not in a way that would blame journalists like us, I don't think, but more just in a sense that some around Burnham feel that actually, if you look at previous, particularly Conservative prime ministers, perhaps there wasn't this baying beforehand for all of the names immediately. I think obviously what we've had is, near a month basically of a period by the time Andy Burnham probably inevitably gets into Downing Street where that looked like it was going to happen and where we didn't have clarity on exactly what these things were. So I think in that sense it's forgivable, but I think there is a sense of actually you've got to get these things right. The big line that we're hearing from Team Andy at the moment, of course, is we're doing the policy and the direction first and we're doing the people second. And to their mind, there is a logic to that actually, people have to see exactly what it is that Burnham is going to want to do and the people kind of fall in after that. There's also the reality of the fact that some of these big decisions haven't yet been made. And so in those circumstances, they're not going to be rushed into making an appointment of, for example, a Chancellor and announcing it. They're saying, look, we've got a Chancellor. It's Rachel Reeves. And when Andy Burnham comes into number 10, there will be another Chancellor and everybody should sort of ever so slightly calm down.
Well, look, just to put the case on the other side of it, when you see Burnham speaking, he says this speculation, this Westminster gossip. Look, the reason there is speculation and gossip is because we are talking about some of the most powerful people in the country and the most powerful offices of state. And who occupies those offices matter. And look, we had a splash on Saturday. It matters enough to close allies of Donald Trump to be briefing heavily against Ed Miliband. Now, that may actually enhance his chances of getting into number 11. But either way, they're clearly very concerned, and it should matter. And the other reason it matters is because the biggest failing of Keir Starmer, as Morgan McSweeney has acknowledged, his former chief of staff, is the lack of preparation. And it is much harder to do this, to actually prepare for government, if it's essentially about 5 or 6 people involved in the accession talks with the civil service. There are not enough people to talk to. So, and I can see why he's doing it. He is doing it because he right now is at his most powerful. This is Andy Burnham, the king. He is untouchable because all of this power resides with him because he hasn't made the appointments. But the moment he does that, there would be division, there would be enmity, there will be people, the winners and losers, right? And that is the point at which, during a delicate Labour leadership process, as someone was pointing out to me, things could go wrong. If someone's really angry, they could try to mount a challenge. It wouldn't succeed, but it could make his life more difficult. So this is all about holding on to maximum power until he actually gets into number 10. So that seems to be the broad strategy. And I think the other things that we're picking up is Team Burnham is now briefing that they don't want to break up the Treasury. So that was a discussion, a genuine conversation that seemed to be happening. They don't want to go that radical anymore. So we'll see what this cabinet looks like when we get to it. But look, the issue remains that there is a hell of a lot we don't know about Andy Burnham's government. For example, William Hague wrote very well a piece in our title about his position on foreign affairs. He wants to be a domestic prime minister, but we don't know what his positions are beyond a kind of solidarity and full support for Ukraine on a lot of the big issues of the day. We're still not clear on what his approach to Donald Trump is going to be, whether he will take a firmer line than Starmer. So we think there is a foreign policy speech somewhere in the offing or intervention of some form in coming days, but there is a kind of hunger for information. I think it is right that there is that hunger because this guy is going to be prime minister in less than a fortnight's time. And that is a big moment for the nation. And therefore, people are probably entitled to ask questions about what he's going to do with power and crucially, who is going to wield that power?
When I was in Poland with Yvette Cooper, that was one of the things I was most keen to know, because she had spoken to Andy Burnham the previous day about foreign policy. And at that point, we'd basically heard nothing. I mean, we still basically heard very little. And I was relying on her from the basis of her conversations with Andy Burnham to let us know that he had reiterated his full support for Ukraine, that he was foursquare behind NATO, for example. These are the kinds of very basic pillars that you would expect from any prime minister, and also a Labour prime minister. But even so, very interesting to hear it from her in that respect. And I think, you're right that we haven't heard a great deal from him with regards to foreign affairs and other questions. And this was something Keir Starmer was obviously asked about on Saturday by Henry Zeffman, a former colleague of ours who's now at the BBC, who essentially, put that question to him about him wanting to be a domestic prime minister, Burnham wanting to be a domestic prime minister. And Starmer essentially said, my successor, because he's obviously not saying that Andy Burnham is definitely his successor yet. My successor will have to spend as much time on foreign policy as I have. And actually, if you look at things like the cost of living, these are questions and issues that are directly affected by what's happening internationally, and that a prime minister should be involved in those sorts of questions as much as they possibly can be. So I think that will be a very, very interesting thing. It's why, for example, his foreign secretary will be a very interesting pick. I wrote at the weekend that Wes Streeting is currently slated in that position, but these things can change. It's quite interesting, having spoken to people about what the policy process has been inside Team Burnham, because Miata Fahnbulleh, who is of course a former minister, she resigned in the wake of the local elections, and she had been running this policy operation for Burnham for some time. She'd been commissioning around a dozen policy papers, and their view was that they should work towards a kind of September autumn transfer of power, right? That's all been slightly condensed.
Slightly.
To put it lightly, they're obviously trying to think about a lot of issues in a very short frame of time, and Josh Simons, who former MP for Makerfield, who stepped aside to let Andy Burnham run and is, part of that team, has also been looking at other policy areas. And I think there's been, among some people, but not all, there's been a sense of slight confusion about how all these pieces fit together.
I mean, just to take listeners into where stories come from sometimes, this circle is both very tight, but also quite loose around the edges. So we've had briefings on some really significant policy announcements from Andy Burnham. We got most of his devolution speech in advance. And the reason for that is it's not necessarily the centre saying this, but there is this loose affiliation of people around him who are very chatty, who do know what the thinking is and what the philosophy is, and have been speaking to Burnham about it. And they're obviously helpful when you're constructing stories like that. But if you talk to Team Burnham, the line from Team Burnham is the only people that know what is going on are Andy Burnham, Lou Haig, and obviously James Purnell, who's his chief of staff and is leading this transition period. So there's kind of circles within circles, if you like, but nonetheless, information is getting out.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. I was writing about at the weekend about some of these really knotty justice questions that they're going to have to grapple with in their early weeks in power, and the fact that they're aware of this. I think one of the key things they're talking about and looking at is what are the things that very early on are going to be a problem for us over the summer period. One of those is the early release scheme for prisoners, which is the next wave is set to be implemented from September on a rolling basis. Now, we know that some victims of child sexual abuse and other crimes have already got letters saying that their perpetrators are set
shocking
for
stories,
really shocking stories, and I think quite harrowing. And you've seen ministers not able to really answer questions about A, how many of these offenders are going to be released, and B, is there any case in which they may not be released, and are they looking at anything to do on this? Because it does seem quite a difficult thing for a government to do, particularly a Starmer government, to leave behind a legacy in circumstances where come September, you might have these people walking free early. Now, this is something I'm told that Team Burnham are looking at extremely closely. I'm told Andy Burnham is very concerned about this, that they're trying to find a way around this. And I think at the moment, that's one of the things that they are most worried about, particularly the optics of Andy Burnham coming into government. And one of the early things they see, these prisoners walking free. Now, I think one of the other questions that's worth thinking about is, of course, there is a prison overcrowding crisis. They're not releasing these prisoners because they want to. The government, they're releasing them because there has been a really, really severe capacity crisis. And Andy Burnham will need to find a way to do that. And so he's been having, obviously, a lot of discussions with MPs in recent weeks. One of the things that's come up, of course, is, do you need to have more resources, for example, in this space? That raises the question of money. That raises the question of, when are they going to do a budget? How are they going to raise these things? So all of these things are not easy issues. Similarly, the controversial jury reforms, replacing trial by jury in many cases, which the government is doing because of a capacity crisis in courts, with, trial by a single judge. Now, that is another thing that Andy Burnham has privately conceded they're not going to be doing. I think this is one of those things where there are these issues that Andy Burnham knows where he sits on. Jury trials is one of them. not releasing child sex offenders from jail is another of them. And yet it is very hard in circumstances where the access talks, for example, haven't been on justice stuff yet. So they simply don't have the full picture of exactly how they're going to be able to do this.
Well, look, handily, across the table from him in these access talks is one of the architects of these policies. So Antonia Romeo used to be the permanent secretary at the Ministry of Justice. She was there with Shabana Mahmood, and they drew up the plans for early release of offenders. And they drew them up, just to be clear, no Prime Minister wants to release offenders early. It is because the prisons are full to breaking point. So that is why they did it. So they are all too aware of the kind of realities of the state of our prison system. And we also think that, I think it was confirmed over the weekend, that Shabana Mahmood has now spoken to Andy Burnham for the first time since Makerfield. And increasingly, that we don't know it yet, but it feels very, very unlikely to me that she's going to be Chancellor, which was being mooted for weeks. We don't know what they discussed, but quite clearly there is a lot of business to be done on home affairs and justice by the looks of things.
Yeah, so I reported that conversation over the weekend, and it's very hard to get any information on what it was that happened during that conversation, but I think the reason why it was significant was in part because people in Andy Burnham's team had said he's not going to talk to Shabana Mahmood until he really knows exactly what it is that he wants to ask her and that he wants from her. And so by the point at which they have that conversation, they'll be in a space where they're ready to really, I think, get down to business on exactly what it is that she's going to do in government. So very interesting. I think you're right. I don't think that it looks like she's made an overt play for the chancellorship in a way that some of those who were concerned by a possible and now probable Ed Miliband chancellorship had hoped that she would do. And it does sound like it's a very genuine thing. I mean, sometimes you will hear ministers say, I'm really happy in my job, I want to stay here. The idea of being promoted to the second most significant cabinet post is not actually something that I really want, but actually secretly, of course, they really desperately do want that. In fact, I would say that's true in the majority of cases when you're talking to ministers about a possible promotion. In this case, I think it is genuinely plausible that Shabana Mahmood genuinely does want to stay in the Home Office for all the invidious problems all the reasons like the invidious problems that any chancellor is going to face under Andy Burnham, completely unavoidably. That's not a criticism of him, but just it is going to be a difficult job. And also because of the fact that she has these prized migration reforms that she's very, very keen to see through and would have to have a lot of trust in whoever it was that then took that helm to make sure that was happening. And frankly, she's very popular in that job. And, I think you can see the logic for her staying there. So I think definitely interesting to see what comes out of that meeting and where all the various chess pieces fall.
I mean, it's quite refreshing in a way, because the whole Shabana Mahmood when pitch around the Chancellor is there isn't a pitch. Her argument is she really likes being Home Secretary. Most ministers and MPs would probably chop their right arm and leg off to get into number 11. And she's like, well, if public duty must, then obviously I'd consider it. And the Prime Minister. So it's very different. We should get onto the question of who is going to live in number 10 or number 11, which is one of the fascinating things, right? We have become used to families living in number 11. So above number 11 Downing Street, it is currently a home to Keir Starmer and his family. It was previously a home to Rishi Sunak and his family. Before that, you go through Boris Johnson and his growing tribe of children with Carrie. They lived there. Various scandals about refurbishments, renovations. What is interesting from what we're picking up is that Andy Burnham doesn't plan to take his family there. His wife works in Manchester. And look, I mean, frankly, living in number 10 comes with enormous scrutiny. It's described as the goldfish bowl for a reason. So there is a world in which you just get Andy Burnham living there 4 days a week, living above the shop, living and breathing it in a kind of slightly strange, I'm not going to say it's a bachelor lifestyle, but I am going to say it's, Andy Burnham eating takeout pizza, reading through his papers and going down. And then obviously he's got number 10 North that he wants to do at least a day a week in. And he wants to do exactly what he did this weekend, which is go watch the rugby league in his constituency and not just symbolically be a prime minister who hails from a northern constituency, but be a prime minister of the North in a very physical, symbolic way. So it's just really interesting. We may not, Ed Miliband, if he became Chancellor, could therefore feasibly move into the flat above number 11, which is the bigger of the two flats that tends to be where families live. But either way, actually, where the Prime Minister lives does matter. And Andy Burnham and his family are clearly giving quite a lot of thought to that.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I think you're right to suggest that on a practical level, there are many reasons why they might not want to be there. This is somebody whose big pitch is that he's going to be a different prime minister and he's going to mark a level of change in circumstances where the current manifesto and his aversion to having a general election means that he's going to have to be generally quite loyal to the things that Labour was already doing.
Yeah.
And the big criticism of him when you speak to slightly salty Starmer aides recently has been, well, so far what I've heard is basically that he's just going to do what we're doing, but he promises slightly better. I mean, this is one of those classic examples of something where he wants to show that he is genuinely approaching being prime minister in a different way. And this is quite an easy way of doing that, I would think. Yeah. So it's really interesting. And I guess on one level, it's not surprising, but it will be very interesting to see how the state mobilizes to make that a plausible scenario, because obviously with all of those things, like there is a great convenience for the state to having the prime minister
on tap,
and his family on tap.